Good morning, everyone, from a snowy Munich this morning. Very happy that you all made it to our Politico pub here in the Rosewood Hotel at the Munich Security Conference. I'm Laurens Cerullis. I'm the cybersecurity editor for Politico in Europe. And I'm happy to be moderating the next panel of our discussion. And we're going to get into questions of wars of the future. So we're going to be discussing technology and how technology is changing the reality of military warfare, both on the battlefield and off the battlefield. And to do so, I've got the pleasure of having three wonderful guests with me today. I'd like to introduce Anne Neuberger, who's a former US Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Threats. Jean-Charles Ellermann-Kingombe, round of applause, wonderful.
Big round of applause here.
Jean-Charles Ellermann-Kingombe, who's NATO Assistant Secretary General for Innovation, Hybrid and Cyber. A little round of applause, perhaps. Yeah. And we've got Christopher Ahlberg, the co-founder and CEO of Recorded Future, a renowned threat intelligence firm. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
So just one quick note to the audience that we will have one panelist leaving at 12:15. Don't be scared. It's not because she didn't like our answers. It's because she has to get to the next session. So, Anne, we do appreciate you being here. Let me just start with quickly talking about setting the scene here. Because clearly there is a race going on. And we've seen that in this current geopolitical climate, there is conflict, there is an increasing tension around defense and security, and that has translated to the technology sector and to technology and the role it plays in defense and security. There's a tech arms race that is going on between militaries, but there's also a technology race that's been going on between governments and that has translated to the industry itself. And so that's what we're going to be talking about the link between how the tech sector is influencing our security and our military engagement, and vice versa. So this is going into issues of artificial intelligence, which is a very prominent topic at this year's Munich Security Conference, and also into issues like drones, cyber offensive capabilities, and other technologies. I guess the obvious question to ask our panel here today, and Anne, if I may start with you, obviously you all come from a background within the sort of the transatlantic space, and my question is, if we look at the technology race and how this is translating into our military capabilities, who is winning the tech race globally right now?
So first, thank you so much, Laurent. It's great to be here with you. It's great to be here with this group here. I would say, just setting the scene a bit, as you noted, the contours of battle and battle space are changing and have already dramatically changed. So when we talk about who is winning, we should first talk about what does battle and battle space look like, and what are the components of victory in that space. Because what we see in battle, so it's no surprise that the evening before Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia conducted an offensive cyber attack on a private sector satellite company providing military communications to Ukraine's military. Right? It was an early shot, traditional military planning, disable your enemy's communications. But it was done via an offensive cyber attack on a private company, because the nature of war has changed in terms of what capabilities are, who's providing them, and frankly, how many military platforms are now software-based in that way as well. So that's the nature of battle. And when we talk about the nature of battle space, in terms of projecting power, we see new hybrid forms of warfare, from trying to disrupt undersea communications to massing swarms of drones. AI plays a key role of that, to a tighter integration of intelligence. So every step in the kill chain, from identifying a target, manufacturing weapons, all the way through to using a particular capability, is radically transforming. So when we think about your question of who is winning, that changes at any given moment in time in terms of agility, in terms of the ability to integrate software into the battle space, and in terms of the ability to use innovation at a particular moment in time.
So this is a challenge I think that NATO is also very engaged in, and we've heard in our reporting, we've heard from NATO officials as well that there is a big challenge around the speed of deployment, the speed of innovation, and the time it takes to get from a lab to a military system or a battlefield. Jean, if you want to comment, what do you think is the state of NATO and its allies right now when it comes to speeding up that innovation?
Well, thank you very much also for inviting me. And I'd like first to actually answer the first question. Who's winning? And I think my answer is the jury is still out. And we have all the conditions for winning. We have state-of-the-art universities, research communities, fantastic companies, both well-established primes, startups. But the fact is that we're not bringing solutions at pace into the hands of our defense forces. You've got the Chinese investing massively, having a seamless system between defense industry and defense. You've got the Russians, not only the Ukrainians, but the Russians learning on the battlefield in Ukraine, managing to bring down developing cycles substantially, as low as 2 to 12 weeks. So the question is, or not the question is, we don't know yet who's winning the race, but we cannot take for granted that we will be winning the race. I think that's the problem and that's the challenge, and therefore one of the things that we are discussing currently in NATO is what can we do to increase the rate, the pace of adoption. And there I think we're particularly looking at the political level and the policy level. At the political level, I think there are two things. One thing is, and I think, I'm a bureaucrat, so I have to say that, innovation is not only about the tech stuff, it's also about bureaucracies, it's about culture, and I think without wanting to delve into regional stereotypes, I think particularly in Europe, there is a lot of risk awareness, and we need to instill a mindset where you accept risk, where you accept that you need to fail in order to succeed. We need to provide the incentive structures in our acquisition systems. So that is one thing. And the second thing is we also need to have a conversation about ring-fencing funding for innovation so that we don't spend all our money now on known platforms, leaving us without the possibility of investing in 2 years with a new thing that will make a difference appears, and to force ourselves to invest in those ecosystems that drive innovation. So that's two on the political level. And then on policy, I think what we're seeing today is many of the new solutions are off-the-shelf solutions from non-defense sectors, from the big tech companies, from startups, and those new entrants bring with them a new way of developing products, much more iterative, where you engage with the end users, and we need to be able to match that. We are focusing on 4 things. One is how to facilitate testing and experimentation. 2, how to ensure procurement, less focus on specific requirements, more on sought-after effects. 3, how to make a connect between those communities. The tech people need to understand what military wants. The military needs to understand what's out there. And then 4th and finally, education. I think many of the top brass in acquisition branches, defense ministries, people like myself, we don't come from tech background. We don't really know the potential. We need to do that education.
Just as one quick follow-up, you mentioned Russia has a development cycle of 2 to 12 weeks. Where are NATO allies at right now?
Well, we have seen over the years that we have not been able to reduce substantially our development cycles. And the NATO allies are not on the field battling right now, so we just said that there is not this drive to bring down the development cycles. So that's also why I think we're often referring to the fantastic prowess of the Ukrainian armed forces, and there is much positive to be said about this. We're just forgetting that at the other end of the fence, side of the fence, the Russians are also learning, and we need to take that seriously.
And if we're on Ukraine and the technologies that we're seeing there, obviously there's been a lot of movement. It will soon be the 3rd anniversary of the conflict. I remember being in Munich 3 years ago, and you felt the tension in the air, and we've seen what it has caused in the last 3 years. My question is, what we've seen on the battlefield there, it gets into AI, it gets into drones, it gets into even things like citizen apps that have helped the Ukrainian army develop its own responses and strategies. What are the things in that conflict that we will see stick around, or that we will see sort of being adopted elsewhere as well? Maybe Christopher.
Yeah, no, I think so. We have our largest deployment, or second largest deployment in the world, in Ukraine, across 19 agencies, ministries, you name it. And what's obviously 95% of that is to try to do the right thing and try to help out, but learning, being able to sort of, and especially in the cyber domain, where this happens very fast. Most times the problem with, I'm not a big fan of the innovation word, by the way. I'm a computer scientist. I think most people who say innovation has never innovated anything. I've cooked up 2 things in my life. That's how I like to think about it. But the rate of sort of coming up with new stuff in Ukraine is very fast. And that 5% of what we've done there is just learning and just being in that cycle. And I think that's maybe the key thing of this. Is not about tech X or tech Y or Z. It's that the Ukrainians are in that learning cycle, and that learning cycle will keep going for years. But to the other point, so will the Iranians, so will the North Koreans, so will the Russians, and pretty much all of our adversaries are in that learning cycle as well. And I think that might be the thing to really take away from this.
And what would your takeaway be from what we've seen in 3 years?
I'll give a practical example, I think, that extends what Chris was referring to, which is one thing that's really transformed in the Ukrainian battle space has been electronic warfare on offense and defense, jamming, and how new satellite constellations make jamming far more difficult, but also how much, I'll take a step back for a moment. A number of years ago, when I was serving in the US intelligence community, I led an effort to modernize what we called our technical SIGINT mission, right? That was the mission to say, how long does it take from the time a new software-defined radar, a new signal comes up, till a platform knows what it is, can characterize it, and can defend against it, right? And we need that. Obviously, the timeline needs to be incredibly tight. At the time, the goal was to get it down to several months from more than a year, and that was achieved. Today, you need software engineers at the forefront, seeing a signal, characterizing what it is, and updating the platforms, because otherwise you have very expensive tanks and other platforms whose capability is precision targeting, and if that precision targeting can be jammed, then you have an expensive platform that's not achieving its impact. Similarly, when you think about the ability of new platforms like drones to deliver in a particular environment, they have to be able to reach their target. And there's been a constant evolution of offense and defense in terms of trying to disrupt the control of those kinds of platforms. So I think the collapse of offensive and defensive space in spectrum space, so that precision targeting can be continued, so that new platforms like drones can deliver in a very contested spectrum space, is something that will be transformative for any battle of the future.
Very similar to when GRU started putting some of their cyber units in Donetsk to be there and grab devices and be able to, again, much faster learning loops and also faster intrusions. But I also think just to sit in the midst of it, as opposed to sitting at home in Moscow and doing this stuff. So again, our dear adversaries are learning as well.
Just 2 examples. I think you're seeing how AI is also impacting existing weapon systems by improving, for instance, precision striking. We can reduce substantially the use of 155 millimeter grenades. One example, and second, I think that is really also a game changer. It's massively reducing decision time, and I think the ability to crunch enormous amounts of data, putting them in the hands of the decision maker, I think is a feature that will impact massively in the long term the way that we conduct warfare. And then I think you said education, learning. I think it also raises more fundamental questions about, the division of labor in the battlefield. What are the kind of profiles we have? How do we learn to work with these things? I think so that long-term impact, and I think so that is at the point that that innovation in tech is not only about the tech stuff, it's also about all the things around it. And right now, we've seen that with the drones, you've introduced the technology on the battlefield before you actually had the doctrine. So we're actually now working on a doctrine for UAVs class 100, less than 150 kilos, because right now many of the Ukrainian drones that have been shot down by Ukrainians. So the doctrine development is now been introduced after the technology itself. So I think an interesting challenge for us.
And when you say you're working on, so the NATO alliance is working
Yes.
on doctrine jointly
Yes.
To define this.
Yes.
So maybe this brings me to, I think, one of the key technologies at the heart, because this goes into drones and it goes into what we've seen in Ukraine, but artificial intelligence. There's been a lot of talk about artificial intelligence in the tech sector for the past 2 years, and we're seeing this really translate also to the Munich Security Conference this weekend, where a lot of the talk is around who holds the control over this technology, who holds power over this technology, and what role does AI play in sort of the technological arms race going on between different regions. My question would be, from what we've seen in the last couple of months, and maybe Anne, if I can ask you from your vantage point of looking at adversaries or other countries like China and Russia, how confident are you about the state of artificial intelligence technology in, say, NATO allied countries versus the state of artificial intelligence in other countries?
So the power of AI, to the topic of the talk, which is wars of the future, really relate to which country or countries bring together the compute, the models, and frankly the data most effectively in platforms at the edge, right? And each of the countries you talked about, each have an advantage. China has a massive advantage in that Chinese cameras are deployed globally around the world, hundreds of millions of cameras. So the ability to train computer vision models on facial recognition, on identification of a particular weapons platform are very advanced. And the ability to deploy that at the edge to a surveillance system to know and characterize a given platform. So I think as we talk about AI, it's important to get specific, to say in the context of, is it intelligence? Is it language identification to try to uncover coded language that military individuals might be using? Is it identification of platforms? Or is it to coordinate efforts in, for example, a wide Pacific Ocean where the challenge is often identification and communication between platforms? What worries me the most, to the question you asked about NATO, is that there's a central contest between authoritarian countries and democracies in the race to deploy AI. And that is because, using the example I gave, China is ahead of, let's say, the US and democracies in training advanced facial recognition models for obvious reasons. It's not concerned about the civil liberties and privacy of its citizens, or when Chinese tech is deployed around the world as part of smart city applications, the citizens of those countries as well. So we have to challenge ourselves as democracies to say we need to deploy AI in line with our values, but also recognize there's risk of doing and risk of not doing, be transparent with our allies, with our citizens about what we're doing, and move out. Because we're in a competition with authoritarian governments where we're not playing the same game. And AI is critical to the battlefield, for examples I gave and examples you've heard from all of us on the panel. And we don't have the option. We need to do it responsibly, but we also need to move out quickly, because it is key to the future in terms of identifying targets, deploying them, and frankly, protecting forces at war.
Yeah, no, I think exactly. We take in an enormous amount of data at Record Future from all kinds of different places, and last 2 years have been all in on trying to use AI for all different things. Now, it is interesting, exactly to Anne's point, that I'm sort of, I'd like to say that there's a non-zero chance that AI will have a winner takes it all sort of outcome, where some country will be the king, and we can't have that be China. So now, facial recognition, there are a few things that we've got to be careful about. But apart from that, it's easy here to see a scenario where we regulate ourselves into losing. And to regulate ourselves into losing, with China being the winner on the other end, bad scenario. There is no hot war and we still lose. So that just is a hard no in my book, and I have no idea how we make that happen. But yeah.
John, you want to come in?
I think if the message here is we need to use the thing, I think I completely concur. And particularly for ISR, surveillance, situational awareness, we're seeing the potential that it offers. We have very recently, in respect of what's happening in the Baltic Sea, deployed increased NATO military presence there. But on the back of that, we have launched what we call the Task Force X, which is a project where we introduce new technology, drones and others, and all the imagery, all the data that it provides, be fused and drawing on AI solutions will provide that situation awareness that allows you to identify patterns, deviations, act before the problem occurs. So I think I think is very much also the mindset, seek and chase the opportunity with AI is very much what we also, I think that's the mindset that we're also pursuing at NATO.
Maybe one question to follow up on the technology is that part of the Biden administration's strategy on artificial intelligence, but also on microchips, for instance, was about controlling the technology, as in where does it go, how is it exported, who gets access to what parts of the technology that the US is producing and owning. And from your perspective, how would you evaluate that strategy and how it turned out? Because it was notoriously hard to stop technology from leaking, right?
Firstly, the most important part of technology is using it for innovation. You want to hold your enemies back, you want to run faster. And I would say running faster is more important than holding your enemies back, right? So that is the most, first, I just want to characterize that. We often get asked about export controls. I strongly believe that actual use of AI in a responsible way, in line with our values, by our military and intelligence community is the most important asset to winning. Trying to control technology is a strategy, but it is a part of the larger approach, and it's far more important to run faster than to try to handicap your adversary. With that said, these are powerful technologies, and to the extent, given, as I noted, that there is not a fair race necessarily between democracies and authoritarian governments in the race to deploy AI models, the Biden administration approach was to say, let's seek to control these technologies. And you saw that in a number of steps related to specifically chips and compute. There are many who look at the recent DeepSeek announcement and say the compute controls did not succeed. And I think there's two angles to that story. One angle is anytime an entity faces resistance, right, faces challenges. The CEO of DeepSeek mentioned that the chip controls had caused them to move out slower, but it also led them to innovate. And indeed they did. It forced them to integrate their platform across the hardware, the architecture, look at the algorithms and development of the models in new and creative ways. And indeed, a lot of their creative approaches, I suspect that US models and European models will also start adopting those as well. So certainly the chip controls made it harder. That led to ongoing innovation. And we should expect that to continue moving forward as well. So I think one would expect some level of continuity because the overall strategy has been both run faster and make it harder for your adversaries. And I think we can expect that to continue.
So excited you're putting it that way because run faster is exactly the thing. They published the source code. Let's grab the source code and do something better out of it. And I think that's exactly right. Run fast.
And to turn to the politics for a second, I've got to follow up because we obviously now have a new administration coming in, and we're slowly seeing the top of what will be national security leadership take place, essentially, being confirmed. So my question is, where you were in the Biden administration, how do you see that being continued or discontinued under President Trump, and what aspects of it can you see being discontinued?
So one can never predict the future unless one is a prophet, and I think the age of prophecy died years ago. Certainly, as we look to what we've been talking about here, as technology is changing the battlefield, we know and we've heard President Trump, his national security advisor, and his team talk about the need to ensure that the military, the intelligence community is adopting technology quickly, and that there's an effective partnership with our private sector, which is the driver of American innovation. It has always been the driver of American innovation. And in that way, I think that keeping the pressure on to ensure that we are adapting. Some of the integration, as somebody, I've worked in the intelligence community over many years to integrate technology to modernize missions. It's good to have a forcing function in many ways. And our forcing function is the broad set of adversaries, whether they're transnational actors, whether they're the closer alliance between Iran, Russia, and China, which worries me significantly, because each of those countries, historically, their distrust of each other has precluded a closer cooperation. And each brings something distinct to a cooperation. And now it feels like their cooperation is getting closer. That is a driver for the West to work closely, to integrate technology faster, and to move out, and of course, to do everything we can to ensure that the most advanced technologies are harder for adversaries to get into their hands. Export controls on advanced technologies was done in the context of Russia. We've seen that when Russian missiles land in Ukraine and they're broken apart, they're using chips from household devices because clearly the controls made it harder for them. And that's important as we see the Russian defense industrial base has really started to gear up and produce technology more at scale than they were able to do at the beginning of the conflict.
Cool.
I think in terms of stepping up, I think with what you describe and with what is at stake, I think we are also realizing increasingly that nations need to work better together, share more info, but also we need more systematically to tap in to what the private sector has to offer. And I think we're seeing that across a number of domains, also in cyber, where we are setting up at NATO a new integrated cyber center, which will not only for the first time bring together all 32 allies with the NATO construct, but also facilitate that the private sector can sit around the table. So tapping into the private sector that sits on piles of data in many, very, very often have the right solutions to facilitate that they can come in, declassify data so they can come in and provide the solution. These kinds of ways of working we need to explore much more, because I think in facing the opposition and what they have to offer, I think we really need to draw on all our strengths.
Yeah, no, I think I moved to the US 27 years ago, having had one idea at the time, and moved there because that was the best place to build a company, and access to capital, smart people, you know, the whole thing, innovation landscape, you pick it, and also a large market of customers. And that's important to remember that, you know, so now we see in the US there's this wave of Palantir and Anduril and SpaceX, and I'd like to think Recorded Future is sort of in that thing too. And I think the sort of the flow in that, and the fact that the US government is willing to actually buy these things now at scale, that will drive an innovation loop that it might outsmart the Apollo mission one day, for like when we look at what that did. And I think as Europeans, for those who are in the room who are Europeans, there's got to be sort of like, you can put in place all the tech, the people, the smarts, the venture capital, but there's got to be a buyer. And showing up at the German Defense Department and try to sell stuff, it is like, it's like passing the Gobi Desert or something. It is not easy. And I'll say it, like probably controversial. You can beat me up afterwards, but it's all right. It is very important, because you can do all that other stuff. If that part doesn't work, it's dead on arrival.
You picked the right place to say it.
That's the cultural thing we discussed before. But maybe also adding to this is the fragmentation, because you can invent the smartest thing in Lithuania, and the Lithuanian defense might be exhilarated and want to buy it, but they'll probably not buy enough for you to actually build a business. And I think we need also to address this fragmentation in how we are developing, testing, experimenting new stuff, so that we from the outset can create also in Europe larger markets that we've been able to in the past.
Great. I'd love to take some questions from the floor if you have some. Max, I can see you in the back, but first I want to thank Anne, because it was wonderful having her on the panel, but she needs to run to the next one. So Anne, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, sir, in the front. Thank you. You may stand up and address the room. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Doju Ilo. I'm the CEO of the Hague Institute of Innovations of Law. Now, so I hear you guys on the need to race, to be ahead of the pack. But I'm also wondering, how are the regulatory framework and the law following this pace of development? Because the laws of wars are changing because of the kind of conflicts we have. Right? Civilians are playing important roles in wars. Private companies are getting involved. And there are issues of privacy, there are issues of property rights, and all of that happening in this, smart race to outwit each other. And I'm wondering, without a complementary regulatory framework, are we not also going into an uncharted territory that could pose fundamental danger to human rights, human safety and security, and even the whole concept of the global world order, where we do things according to certain, framework of understanding or rules? But it doesn't seem to me that what is happening now is actually governed by any clear rules. And how are you guys responding to that? And do you consider that to be a threat?
This is a very valid question. I want to thank you for the question, because we have been going on about military innovation, but there is a big question around safety, around the rules, around the impact that it has, and around non-proliferation. Can you get the genie back in the bottle if you invent arms in a new way? Is this a process that you can control in some way? So thank you for the question. Anyone wants to comment?
Yeah, no, I think, again, Ukraine, good example. Other places on the planet too that might be more controversial, will stick to Ukraine. Various sort of parts of the world asked us to get involved, and we got involved. And I remember asking early on, so where's the air cover? But, everybody's, no, get involved. And about 30 days ago, Russia declared us an enemy of the state, undesirable, or whatever they call it. Thank you very much. And so, exactly to your point, this is not a Mickey Mouse sort of thing. You have to sort of know the game you're in. And of course, we need laws on many of these things. Now, at the same time, if I get lost first and then die versus I'll survive and then get the loss, I do think that it's important to run first and be alive. So,
Sean, any thoughts?
I think we've had, and we have, NATO policies on responsible use of AI, and we have set down various mechanisms, the so-called DAR board, where we exchange information, share best practices. So there are discussions around this, but at the same time, we're also seeking the opportunity. And I think right now, again, coming back to the race, the ability to adopt fast is one that we cannot leave aside, while we also address other very legitimate, difficult issues.
What I find interesting, and we'll get to cybersecurity still, but what is interesting is that when we talk about technology and the role it plays in warfare, the line between what is essentially the rules of war versus what is international law in peace or between peaceful partners, that line blurs constantly. And so it's very challenging to the policy frameworks that we've built up in the last couple of decades. Just exactly where do you draw that line, and in which space are you exactly? And we'll get to that with cybersecurity in a second. Just want to ask Jesse, Max at the back has a question.
But may I just add, though, while you're miking up, I think the difficulty for us, but that's also a self-imposed difficulty, is that NATO and the Western Alliance, we abide by international rule of law. I think that is the self-constructed obstacle, but that's a good obstacle. That's what defines who we are. So I think so we have no intentions of breaking with that. What we're seeing, I think that has not to do with the AI, but there's been a lot of discussions about how can we push back on in the Baltic Sea in response to what's happening with our critical undersea infrastructure. And there we have seen new patterns of acting in that hybrid response, which go to the boundary of the law of the sea, but still you stay within that space because that's the space which is important for us. So it's only to say that there is a difficulty. This is a challenge for us, but that challenge must not prevent us from at the same time going after the solutions. Because also in cybersecurity, I mean, the adversaries are not only fielding and disregarding these more moral, legal issues. They are also using developed instruments that are then pointing at us. I mean, we are also fending off cybersecurity driven by AI every day, every minute.
It's very good. The adversary will every time use the law against us. Why is we don't have a cybercrime problem? No. We have a Russian cybercrime problem, and those Russian cyber criminals will use it against us. So that's why we have to be very careful that we don't invent laws that hurt ourselves, but the adversary is just smiling and laughing all the way to the bank. So,
Max.
Co-director of Virtual Roots. Continuing on this theme, Ukraine has made a decision to conduct many of its offensive cyber operations through semi-state actors like the Ukrainian IT army, rather than integrate them deeply within the state, like spinning off quickly a cyber command. To what degree has this made the opportunity for both governments as well as the private sector harder to support them in some of these efforts to strike back, as such an efforts from Ukraine also blur the boundaries between civilians and military actors operating against Russia?
So first of all, I do not know of any private company that has gotten involved with these guys that you're referring to, and I think I have decent insight. And so just I don't know of any of that. Even this Ukrainian IT army sort of thing, I don't know what that really is actually. It was a big Telegram channel with lots of clicks on it. I would not try to overrate that, and I think some of their successful stuff, again with no knowledge, I think has been done in other ways. So
are you saying the impact of the Ukrainian army was?
Yeah, I'm trying to be vague without I think private companies should not get involved in offensive cyber, in general, is sort of my mind. And number two, on those Ukrainian elements you're referring to, I think A, may not exist, and B, I do not know of any companies gotten involved with it. So sorry to shoot you down. But
If you say private companies should not be involved in offensive operations, that would mean it would be a strict competence of militaries and defense ministries, but they do rely on technology support services from private companies. So how do you draw the line there? Maybe Jean, if you want to comment on that as well.
I mean, I'm not aware of governments, but certainly not NATO, drawing on private companies to conduct offensive cyber activities. In general, NATO relies on capabilities provided by nation states, allied nation states, and that goes, I think, for all domains.
We've heard we interviewed a Latvian foreign minister, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, who made a plea to be less cautious or more vocal about the need for cyber offensive operations, specifically mentioning that countries should be open to talk about these capabilities exist, they are being used, and countries should increasingly be open about talking about offensive cyber operations, especially when it comes to countries like Russia, which he specifically was referring to. What's your take there? Why are we still not able to address it or speak about it publicly?
I think in general, and I think cyber, falls under a broader umbrella of what we call hybrid warfare, and And I think where we've seen in recent years an intensification of activity and also an increased recklessness in activity. And I think from our point of view in NATO, when we are currently developing new strategy on the subject, I think we need to have a more robust response. I think a response that allows us to deter in a way that with an ambition of reducing the pressure on us on cyber in general, in hybrid in general, including cyber. So I think that conversation about a more robust response, ensuring that it is not felt as risk-free to impose cost on us. I think that conversation is very much one that we're having under this overall hybrid agenda.
I think this is, and I think what Anne would say, I cannot speak for her at all, but in the US, intelligence agencies have become more open, talking about what they're doing and what sort of operations they do. I think it's the same thing for cyber operations, and cyber operations, kind of to the point of the legal question here earlier, should be done by countries and executed by countries, and private companies should stay away from that. There are a few companies in Israel, there are a few companies in some other places who fiddles in that, and it's a bad idea. So.
I've got 2 more questions from the floor if the mic is still going around. Great, Christina will be with you in a second. Sorry, there's just one first there, and then we come to you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gert Auvert, Chief of Cybersecurity Center from Estonia. I have a question, deterrence in cybersecurity. From NATO perspective, from the collective West perspective, does it work? And then attribution as one of the keys there. Well, we do it as nation states. We do it together, we do it collectively, we do it alone. If the result of this is that the person who is attributed is hailed as a hero back home, then what's the point?
That's a critical question with a deeper meaning. John?
First question, does deterrence work? I think yes and no. I think we have been doing a lot in recent years in building our resilience, not least in the cyber domain. So yes. At the same time, as I mentioned before, we are seeing a continuous increase in cyber activity. So in that respect, we have not managed to deter cyber. So it's a yes and it's a no. And then there is the discussion about attribution, which is an important one. Attribution is still for the nations to call. But I think this is also the conversation that we would like to open with on the new hybrid strategy. I think what we've seen, the response we did in the Baltic Sea, was actually not in response to a specifically attributed incident. It was in response to a pattern, an observed pattern that we could see, whether deliberate or not, both resonated with what we know our adversaries have as ambition, and 2, was putting in danger critical infrastructure for the alliance. So we were actually able, that strengthened effort you've seen in the Baltic Sea, we've done that without a specific attribution. And I think whilst attributing is super important and we should strive for it, we should not necessarily always wait for it, because attribution is usually something that comes on the back of an investigation. That can take 6 months, that can take 2 years. But the harm is being done now, and if we want to deter, we need also to send a signal. That can be an asymmetric signal, asymmetric response. For instance, sending more ships into the Baltic Sea. If there's one thing that's certain, the Russians don't like to have more NATO ships in the Baltic Sea. So my point is that yes, attribution is important, belongs to the allies themselves, but we as NATO can do things also without a specific attribution.
That's a very good point. I did promise one last question, Christina, and then we're going to have to wrap it up because my clock is rapidly ticking towards 0. But if you can keep your question short, and if we can keep our response short, that would be wonderful.
Hi, my name is Trine Flockhart. I'm from the European University Institute in Florence. And my question is a bit sort of bird's eye view, because as we are speaking now, I think we're in real danger that the liberal international order is fracturing, so that we end up with an American order and a European order. So I'm wondering, as you've touched on several times, it's well known that the United States innovates and the EU regulates. What can the EU in this, is there a silver lining of innovative people not wanting to stay in Trump's America? And what can the EU do to allure them back to Europe and to place their innovative energy in the EU?
If you think about what do they call them, sea turtles coming back to China, they offer them a more enormous amount, that's the word they use, and I think they now talk about being on the third wave of sea turtles come back to China. Huge research grants, the ability to build companies. I bet you they have better stock option programs in China than they have in the EU writ large. Make it easy to build companies, make it easy to do all the different things you need to do, whether it's, again, academic funding or build something entrepreneurial. Now, I happen to live in Boston with lots of foreigners. I'm half Swedish, half American. So have I heard of a single person who wants to move back because of this? I think don't have too big of illusion, but...
Can't say it's not a nice setting, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to close with one question, which is a yes or no, and it gets us back to cybersecurity and the question of how does this play a role in military conflict. Yes or no, are we going to see a cyber attack that amounts to what triggers Article 5 within NATO in the coming year? Jean?
You cannot exclude it.
Christopher?
It's possible.
Those are two vague answers, but we'll take them. Thank you so much. Thank you for a wonderful discussion, and thank you all for being in the room. It's very helpful.